Sometime in 1983, on a mountainside in Vernon Township, New Jersey, a man tied off the ankles and sleeves of a janitorial jumpsuit, stuffed it with sand, fabricated a head out of a plastic grocery bag, and sent it down an enclosed water slide with a complete vertical loop. The dummy came out the other end decapitated. So they built another dummy and sent that one down. It came back dismembered. They tried again, same result. And then Gene Mulvahill, the man who had sketched the design for this slide on a cocktail napkin, without a single hour of engineering training in his life, offered his teenage employees $100 each to write it themselves. Some of them said yes. That slide, the Cannonball Loop, would become the most infamous amusement park ride in American history. But the Cannonball Loop was not an aberration. It was the purest expression of the place that built it, a 250-acre amusement park in rural New Jersey that over 18 years of operation killed at least 6 people, injured thousands more, bought ambulances for the local township because its accident rate was overwhelming the volunteer rescue squad, and generated such ferocious loyalty among its visitors that a generation of kids from the New York metropolitan area would later describe surviving it the way veterans describe surviving combat. The park's slogan was, "There's nothing in the world like Action Park." That was, for once, the understatement. To understand how Action Park came to exist, you have to understand Gene Mulvahill, because Action Park was Gene Mulvahill. His appetites, his charm, his contempt for limits, his absolute refusal to hear the word no, poured into concrete and fiberglass and chlorinated water. Eugene Mulvihill was born in 1934 in West Orange, New Jersey, a working-class town in Essex County. He earned a degree in business administration from Lehigh University in 1956, served as a captain in the Marine Corps, and then went to Wall Street, where he discovered his true talent, which was selling things to people who probably shouldn't be buying them. Gene founded a brokerage firm called Mayflower Securities. It specialized in penny stocks, the barely regulated, wildly speculative micro-shares that traded for cents on the dollar and attracted the kind of investors who confused gambling with investing. Gene was, by most accounts, a spectacularly charismatic operator. The Class Action Park documentary would later describe him as Gordon Gekko before there was a Gordon Gekko, a blend of P.T. Barnum and Donald Trump. Every time a salesman closed a deal, Gene would blast a bugle through the office while champagne bottles cracked open. It was the 1970s on Wall Street, and the boiler rooms were in full swing. One of his protégés at Mayflower was a young accountant from Newark named Robert Brennan, who became president of the firm and later went on to found First Jersey Securities. First Jersey would grow to over 1,200 employees across 36 sales offices, generating profits around $95 million a year at its peak. Brennan filmed television commercials standing next to a company helicopter, inviting investors to join in the fun. The fun, as the SEC eventually determined, was a systematic penny stock fraud that swindled clients out of hundreds of millions of dollars. First Jersey went bankrupt in 1987. Brennan was convicted of securities fraud in 1994, ordered to pay $75 million, declared bankruptcy, hid $4.5 million in casino chips and municipal bonds from the court, and was eventually sentenced to more than 9 years in prison for money laundering. He and Gene remained close for decades. The money that built Action Park and the money that funded First Jersey Securities flowed at various points through the same networks of investors and associates. Gene's ski resort and Brennan's brokerage were 2 branches of the same tree. But Gene got to the exit first. On November 11, 1974, the SEC suspended Mayflower Securities for selling worthless stocks in a bankrupt electronics company. Brennan, characteristically, had already founded First Jersey that same day using Mayflower's assets. Gene was effectively barred from the securities industry for life. He was 39 years old, a Marine captain turned Wall Street operator turned industry pariah, and in need of a new way to make money. Most people at that juncture might have downsized their ambitions. Gene Mulvahill was not most people. One of his Wall Street investments happened to be the Vernon Valley Ski Area, a modest resort in Sussex County, New Jersey, about an hour northwest of New York City. When Vernon Valley went bankrupt, Gene's company, Great American Recreation, scooped it up. He soon acquired the neighboring Great Gorge Resort as well, combining them into a single large ski operation in the highlands of Vernon Township. It was 1972. Gene was a businessman with no ski resort experience, standing on a mountainside, looking at a pile of trails and lifts that made money for 4 months of the year and sat idle for the other 8. That idle mountainside was the problem, and the problem was what made Gene Mulvahill dangerous, because Gene Mulvahill could not look at a problem without seeing something that everyone else would have the good sense to walk away from. He traveled to West Germany, where he'd heard about a new kind of summer attraction, the Alpine Slide. It was a concrete track built into a mountainside with small wheeled carts that riders could pilot down a winding chute using a handbrake. Gene decided to build one on his ski slopes. He enlisted his children, including his son Andy, who was barely a teenager, and some neighborhood kids to help dig the track into the mountain alongside resort employees. The slide opened for the summer of 1976, and it was an immediate hit. People loved the speed, the wind, the feeling of racing down a mountain on a sled they controlled themselves. That word, control, was the idea that organized everything Gene Mulvahill would build for the next 2 decades. Gene's philosophy was simple, and Andy would later articulate it plainly. He wanted to take the idea of skiing, which is exhilarating because you control the action, and transfer it to an amusement park. There's inherent risk in that, but that's what makes it fun. At a regular amusement park, at Six Flags, at Disney, you got strapped in and the ride did the work. Gene wanted the opposite. He wanted the rider to decide how fast, how high, how far. He wanted the customer in the driver's seat, literally and figuratively, with the understanding that a driver can always crash. By the summer of 1978, Gene had added 2 water slides and a go-kart track. He renamed the summer operation Action Park and formally opened it on July 4th of that year with 2 promotional events that told you everything you needed to know about the sensibility of the place: a Dolly Parton look-alike contest and a tobacco juice spitting competition. The following year came more water slides, a deep-water swimming pool, tennis courts, and a softball field, all lumped together under the name Water World. By 1980, Gene had carved a second section, Motor World, out of the swampland across State Route 94. Combined with the Alpine Center on the mountain itself, Action Park now sprawled across 250 acres with 3 distinct zones, 75 rides, 35 of them motorized and self-controlled, 40 of them water slides, and the beginnings of a reputation that would make it the most talked-about amusement park in the northeastern United States. The Alpine Slide, that first attraction, set the template. The chute was made of concrete, fiberglass, and asbestos. The carts had a single control stick that offered, according to a former employee, 2 settings: extremely slow and death awaits. Riders wore bathing suits because the slide was part of a summer resort. When they fell, and they fell constantly because the carts jumped the track on nearly every curve, the concrete and fiberglass shredded their skin. Hay bales were placed at the turns in a half-hearted attempt to cushion impacts. Riders on the chairlift going up would spit on riders coming down or knock the carts off the lift for sport. Between 1984 and 1985 alone, state records documented 14 fractures and 26 head injuries on the Alpine Slide. The state ordered the park to remove exposed rocks along the track. Inspectors never came back to check whether the order had been carried out. The rocks stayed. And the Alpine Slide was, by the standards of Action Park, one of the less alarming attractions. In 1981, the park opened the Tidal Wave Pool, one of the first wave pools in the country. It was 100 feet wide, 250 feet long, 8 feet deep at the far end, and filled with fresh water, not salt water, which would have made swimmers more buoyant. 4 massive fans generated waves that could reach 40 inches in height, churning for 20 minutes at a stretch, with 10-minute breaks in between. The pool could hold up to 1,000 people. On its opening day, lifeguards had to rescue an estimated 100 swimmers. Not over the course of the season, on the first day. 12 Red Cross certified lifeguards were stationed at the pool at all times, and on the busiest weekends, they were pulling as many as 30 people from the water per day. To put that in context, the average lifeguard at a community pool or lake might make 1 or 2 rescues in an entire summer. The lifeguards at Action Park's wave pool were hitting that number before lunch. They called it the Grave Pool. 3 people drowned there, a 15-year-old boy in 1982, a 20-year-old man in 1984, and an 18-year-old in 1987. Over in Motor World, across Route 94 from the main park and connected by a monorail called the Transmobile, the chaos was motorized. The super go-karts had governor devices that limited their speed to about 20 miles per hour. Park employees figured out that jamming a tennis ball into the governor would bypass it entirely, and they did this routinely, for themselves and for guests, turning a children's go-kart ride into a 50-mile-per-hour demolition derby that left people with head-on collision injuries. The gasoline fumes from poorly maintained engines overcame some riders as they drove. The Lola cars, miniature open cockpit racers on a longer track, could be similarly modified, with similarly harmful results. After the park set up a small micro-brewery nearby, employees would break in at night, steal the beer, and take the Lola cars out joyriding on Route 94, the actual state highway. The Battle Action tanks, one of the most heavily advertised attractions, let guests drive small tanks in a chain-link enclosure and shoot tennis ball cannons at each other's vehicles. When workers entered the cage to fix a crashed tank, which happened several times a day, they were pelted with tennis balls from every direction. One guest soaked a tennis ball in lighter fluid, set it on fire, and launched it at another tank before being ejected from the park. The employees considered the Battle Action tanks the worst assignment in the park, more dangerous for the staff than the visitors. The super speedboats, meanwhile, raced around a small pond at 35 to 40 miles per hour, a pond that employees knew was heavily infested with snakes. There was also, briefly, a skate park. It was so badly designed, bowls separated by pavement that didn't meet the edges smoothly, that a former employee named Tom Fergus later told the magazine Weird NJ that the skate park was responsible for so many injuries we covered it up with dirt and pretended it never existed. And in 1992, the park opened the Gladiator Challenge, an attraction loosely based on the television series American Gladiators, in which guests ran obstacle courses and fought park-employed bodybuilders with padded pugil sticks. On at least one occasion, a guest who felt a gladiator had been too rough came back with his friends to settle the score. The gladiator called in reinforcements of his own. A brawl involving several dozen people erupted, and the Vernon Township police had to be called in to restore order. Then there was the Tarzan Swing, a steel arch on a 20-foot cable over a spring-fed pool. Riders would grab the bar, swing out over the water, and drop. The pool beneath the swing was fed by natural springs. The water temperature hovered between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 or 30 degrees colder than the rest of the park's attractions. Swimmers who plunged in were so shocked by the cold that their muscles seized, and lifeguards had to haul them out. In 1984, a man suffered a fatal heart attack immediately after dropping from the swing into the freezing water. The park sold beer at kiosks all over the grounds, and the drinking age was enforced with roughly the same rigor as the speed limits on the go-karts. Doctors at the nearest hospital reported that many of the injured patients they treated from Action Park were intoxicated. The emergency room director said they were seeing 5 to 10 Action Park victims on the busiest days. Eventually, Great American Recreation purchased additional ambulances for the town of Vernon because the park was monopolizing the volunteer rescue squad's entire fleet. Gene Mulvahill's response to all of this was, characteristically, to build more. The first death at the park had come on July 8, 1980, when 19-year-old George Larson, Jr. was thrown from an alpine slide cart, struck his head on a rock, and died 8 days later. Gene told reporters that Larson was an employee because a customer's death would have required a report to the state. Larson had, in fact, been a ski lift operator at Vernon Valley the previous winter, but his employment had ended before the accident. His family accused the park of using his old payroll status to dodge the reporting requirement. The rocks that state inspectors had ordered removed were still there. 2 years later, in the span of 8 days in the summer of 1982, 2 more people died. On July 24th, 15-year-old George Lopez drowned in the tidal wave pool. On August 1st, 27-year-old Jeffrey Nathan got out of his overturned kayak on the Kayak Experience ride and stepped on a grate in contact with exposed live wiring for the underwater fans that agitated the water. He was electrocuted and died of cardiac arrest at a hospital in nearby Warwick, New York. 2 of Nathan's relatives standing nearby were also injured. The park initially disputed that the electric current caused the death, claiming no burns were found on Nathan's body. The coroner pointed out that burns generally don't occur in a water-based electrocution. The park claimed the exposed wiring was just a nick. Others who examined the scene said it was closer to 8 inches of bare wire. The ride was drained and never reopened. The park said that people would be afraid to go on it afterward, a rare admission from a company that never admitted much, that fear had limits even at Action Park. The State Labor Department concluded that no safety violations had occurred, though it also noted that a 19-ampere electrical current was still flowing through the ground circuit 3 days after the incident. And yet the people kept coming. That is the part of the Action Park story that no simple narrative of negligence or corporate greed can fully explain. The park drew over 1 million visitors a year during the 1980s, with as many as 12,000 on the busiest weekends. The TV commercials were relentless and effective. Cheesy jingles, footage of tanned kids hurtling down slides and splashing into pools, the tagline blaring over every ad buy in the tri-state area. The action never stops at Action Park. For a kid growing up in North Jersey, Central Jersey, the New York suburbs, or Southern Connecticut in the 1980s, Action Park was a rite of passage. It was cheaper and closer than Six Flags Great Adventure. It was wilder than anything else on offer. And its reputation for danger was not a deterrent. It was the selling point. Since many of the rides routed their waiting lines so that everyone in line could watch every previous rider, the audience dynamic was baked into the experience. People played to the crowd. The Tarzan swing was notorious for outbursts of profanity and exhibitionism as riders swung out over the freezing pool in full view of the line behind them. Collisions on the Colorado River ride sometimes escalated into fistfights between rafts. On one occasion, a group of visiting bodybuilders threw the lifeguards into the pool the lifeguards were supposed to be guarding. The lifeguards called in friends as reinforcements. The police were called. Surf Hill, a water-slick sliding surface, generated such reliable carnage, injuries, lost bikini tops, spectacular wipeouts, that Gene Mulvahill built a dedicated viewing area next to the snack bar so that employees and guests could eat lunch and watch the show. In a world that was already beginning to child-proof and liability-proof every public space in America, Action Park was the last holdout, the place where you could test yourself against a ride that might actually hurt you. In a world filled with no, one former visitor recalled, Action Park became the land of yes. Guests who were injured often happily accepted complimentary passes for future visits as compensation. They came back. There was a ride called the Aqua Scoot, where riders carried a hard plastic sled up to the top of a slide, shot down a ramp of industrial rollers, and were supposed to skip across a shallow pool at the bottom like a stone on water. If you leaned back at exactly the right angle, you skimmed across. If you leaned forward, even slightly, the sled submarined and launched you head first into the pool. The Colorado River Ride, a raft-based run down a wooded hillside, was designed with a trough crafted to look like a natural riverbed, which meant the ride surface was deliberately rough. Rafts slammed into rock walls, riders bashed heads with each other, and the collisions sometimes led to fistfights. At one point, the park began requiring riders to wear football helmets. By 1983, Gene was ready for his masterpiece. He sketched a design on a cocktail napkin, an enclosed water slide with a complete vertical loop, like a roller coaster, but with nothing but water and gravity and a human body in a bathing suit. No engineer designed it, no physicist checked the math. Gene drew it on a napkin and had it built. They tested it with those sand-stuffed janitorial jumpsuits. The dummies came back mangled. After padding was added to the interior walls, Gene offered his teenage employees $100 each to try it. Some did. Tom Fergus, one of the employees who wrote it, later said that $100 did not buy enough booze to drown out that memory. Andy Mulvihill was, by his own account, the first live person to go down after the dummies. He wore a full set of ice hockey protective equipment. The Cannonball Loop was not fun, he recalled. It was more like a ride you ride to survive than to have fun. When the ride opened to the public in 1985, riders came back with mysterious lacerations. Investigation revealed the cause: teeth. Teeth that had been knocked out of earlier riders' mouths and become embedded in the foam padding on the interior walls. A former Navy physician who examined the ride determined that riders were experiencing up to 9 Gs of acceleration going through the loop, roughly what a fighter pilot experiences in a military jet. At least one rider got stuck at the top of the loop due to insufficient water pressure, and a hatch had to be installed at the bottom of the slide for future extractions. The state's Advisory Board on Carnival Amusement Ride Safety shut the Cannonball Loop down after a single month of operation. It would reopen sporadically over the years, a few days here, a few days there, before injuries forced its permanent shutdown. For the rest of the park's existence, the Cannonball Loop sat near the entrance of Waterworld, visible to everyone walking in, a monument to something that had actually existed in the world. There was also the Bailey Ball, which never opened to the public, and the story of its single test explains why. The concept was a large steel sphere in which a rider would be strapped and rolled downhill along a track made of PVC pipe built alongside a ski trail. The designers failed to account for the fact that PVC expands in heat. On a hot summer day, with a state inspector watching, the ball, with a live test subject inside, went off the track. It bounced down the ski slope, rolled through the parking lot, crossed Route 94, and came to rest in a swamp on the far side of the highway. The inspector left without saying a word. The park abandoned the project. Gene's solution to the mounting legal exposure was exactly what you would expect from a man who had learned his business instincts on the penny stock floors of Lower Manhattan. Since no legitimate insurance company would cover Action Park, Gene set up his own insurance company in the Cayman Islands. The policy he was supposed to carry was worth $2.1 million. The company he created to underwrite it existed essentially on paper. Without real insurance, any lawsuit settlement would have to come out of the park's own pockets, which meant Gene's policy was never to settle. If you sued Action Park, Gene fought. If you won, he didn't pay until the marshals came to collect. By 2000, court filings alleged that roughly 2,400 injury claims had been filed against Great American Recreation. The scheme did not go unnoticed. A state investigation into improprieties in the leasing of state land to Action Park uncovered the unauthorized insurance company and led to a 110-count grand jury indictment against 9 related companies and their executives. Many of those indicted took pre-trial intervention to avoid prosecution. Gene Mulvahill pleaded guilty in November 1985 to 5 counts of insurance fraud. He was not imprisoned. The park kept operating. The staff, and this detail matters, were almost entirely teenagers. Jim Desai became the park's security director at the age of 21 after 2 years on the job. Most ride operators were younger. Many were underage to be working the positions they held, a fact the state cited repeatedly in safety violations. Training sessions existed but were largely performative. In the documentary Class Action Park, former employees recalled that lifeguard training drills were used as pretexts for hazing. New hires were made to play the drowning victim and were then abandoned in the water to get out on their own. Height and weight restrictions on rides were routinely ignored. Many employees were, by their own admission, frequently drunk on the job. Nobody cared. The culture of the staff mirrored the culture of the guests. Rules existed, theoretically, the way guardrails existed, as things you could see but were not expected to take seriously. The park's approach to reporting injuries was revealing. Action Park only reported accidents where someone had to be transported in an ambulance. This was unique among New Jersey amusement parks. Everything below that threshold, the fractures, the concussions, the lacerations, the dislocated shoulders, went unrecorded. Employees had their own internal language for managing risk. Lifeguards used the acronym CFS to alert each other when a visitor who clearly couldn't swim was heading toward deep water. What the letter stood for isn't suitable for polite company, but the first 2 words were can't and a vulgarity. In some cases, the same person had already been rescued from deep water once and was heading back in. Amid all this, Gene kept innovating. In 1987, Action Park became the first American amusement park to install an aerodium, a skydiving simulator wind tunnel originally invented in Germany, where riders in special suits were lifted by a massive fan. Stadium seating surrounded the attraction so spectators could watch. It was, by the park standards, one of the safer additions. Gene never stopped looking for the next thing. He couldn't stop. The man who had been thrown off Wall Street for selling worthless securities had found a product that, unlike penny stocks, people actually wanted: the feeling of getting away with something. The park was run by teenagers, visited by teenagers, lubricated by beer, and overseen by a man who had already been thrown out of one profession for fraud and was currently under indictment in another. The state, for its part, proved almost comically toothless. Between 1979 and 1986, Action Park received numerous citations for safety violations, including allowing minors to operate rides and failing to report accidents. An investigation by the New Jersey Herald later found that the park was fined exactly once. Every other amusement park in New Jersey was fined for first offenses. Action Park alone received repeated warnings with no consequences. As Sussex County's largest employer, the park had significant leverage over the local township government. Gene was, it appears, as skilled at schmoozing regulators as he had been at selling penny stocks. But the physics of the situation, financial physics, legal physics, the physics of bodies breaking on concrete, could not be schmoozed indefinitely. Gene's policy was never to settle lawsuits, and only to pay compensation after a judgment, and typically a determined collection effort on the plaintiff's part. This meant that the legal costs accumulated rather than resolved. The early 1990s brought a recession that shrank attendance. Lawsuits forced the closure and dismantling of several rides. The slingshot bungee cord ride, which launched riders upside down on a cord and which employees privately wondered generated untold numbers of whiplash cases, operated from 1993 to 1995 before the insurance exposure shut it down. The Gladiator Challenge was stripped out and replaced with a beach volleyball court. One by one, the rides that had defined the park were removed, leaving gaps in the landscape like pulled teeth. The insurance premiums that Gene had so ingeniously avoided were now being replaced by something worse. Actual judgments, actual payouts, actual legal bills piling up in actual courtrooms. Gene's old partner, Robert Brennan, whose financial empire had been a quiet source of capital for the park's operations, was himself collapsing. First Jersey Securities had gone bankrupt in 1987. Brennan was convicted of fraud in 1994. The money was drying up. In 1989, Great American Recreation had negotiated a deal to sell the entire Vernon Valley/Great Gorge operation, including Action Park, for $50 million to the International Broadcasting Corporation. IBC inspected the properties, reconsidered, and walked away. By early 1995, GAR was operating the resort with no liability insurance at all. New Jersey, remarkably, did not require it. First Fidelity Bank, which had lent $19 million to GAR and 15 related corporations, filed suit to begin foreclosure proceedings. Law firms owed money for work performed between 1991 and 1993 began filing their own suits. In November 1995, a deal with Noramco Capital Corporation and the Predium Fund of C.S. First Boston temporarily staved off foreclosure by purchasing the debt owed to First Fidelity. It was a bandage on an amputation. In February 1996, creditors who had taken on GAR's $14 million debt petitioned to force the company into bankruptcy. GAR filed for Chapter 11 protection in March, publicly insisting it could regain financial footing within a year. Action Park opened for what would be its final season that summer. On Labor Day, September 2nd, 1996, the gates closed at the end of the day. Nobody knew it yet, but they would not reopen. As the 1997 summer season approached, GAR kept announcing opening dates and then pushing them back. First, June 14th, then late June, then mid-July. On June 25th, 1997, Great American Recreation announced the cessation of all operations. Action Park was dead. The company was reportedly as much as $48 million in debt. The Freedom Recovery Fund purchased the entire Vernon Valley/Great Gorge property, including Action Park, for $10 million. 8 years earlier, someone had offered $50 million for the same property, and Gene Mulvahill had thought he could do better. Freedom put a management company in charge and made plans to spend $20 million upgrading the ski resort and remodeling the water park. Instead, in February 1998, Canadian resort developer IntraWest bought the property and set about the thorough, methodical work of making the place safe. A Star Ledger headline captured the transition. Days of beer and bungees end as Action Park goes family. They renamed it Mountain Creek Water Park. Rides were renovated, reinforced, or removed entirely. The bungee tower was demolished. The Cannonball Loop, which had sat near the entrance of Waterworld for years as a kind of monument to hubris, was dismantled. The Motorworld section, that kingdom of go-karts and battle tanks and snake-infested speedboat ponds on the far side of Route 94, was left to sit undisturbed until condominiums and a parking lot eventually replaced it. The Transmobile monorail was mostly torn down. The Cobblestone Village station and the right-of-way through the miniature golf course were among the few remnants left standing. The Alpine Slide, that first ride, the concrete chute where it all began, the one that had produced more injuries, more lawsuits, and more state citations than any other attraction, was kept open for one final season under Mountain Creek management in 1998. For the first time, riders were required to wear helmets and knee pads. The last day of operation was September 6th of that year. A rainy Labor Day meant the slide was closed the following day, and people's last rides down the mountain happened without ceremony. The chutes were torn out afterward, but the route they carved into the mountainside can still be seen from the gondola that replaced the old chairlift. It runs down the slope like a scar. Gene Mulvahill never stopped. He developed the Crystal Springs Golf Resort adjacent to the old property. He invested in cancer drugs, robotics, cellular broadcasting, and real estate. In 2010, at the age of 76, he led a group of investors to buy back Mountain Creek and restored the Action Park name, hoping to capitalize on the extraordinary nostalgia that had turned the park into a cult phenomenon. Plans were floated for an updated version of the Cannonball Loop. It was never built. The magic, if that's the word, was gone. So were some of the investors. And so, on October 27, 2012, was Gene. He died at 78. His son Andy later wrote, with a candor that functions as both epitaph and confession, "Gene cut a lot of corners, and sometimes he got caught and there were repercussions. That's what happens when you live life like there's no tomorrow." By 2016, the Mountain Creek name had been restored and the Action Park brand retired for the second and final time. The park that operates today on that mountainside in Vernon Township is a modern, regulated, insured, inspected facility. The wave pool is shallower. The lifeguards are trained. The beer kiosks do not serve minors. Nobody is offering teenagers $100 to test an untested ride. The nostalgia, though, has proved more durable than the park itself. Action Park became a cultural touchstone for an entire generation. Chris Gethard, a comedian and writer, put it this way: "When I get to talking about it with other Jerseyans, we share stories as if we are veterans who served in combat together. I suspect that many of us may have come closest to death on some of those rides up in Vernon Valley." Matthew Callan, writing in 2000, offered the eulogy that felt truest to those who had been there. Action Park made adults of a generation of tri-state area kids who strolled through its blood-stained gates by teaching us the truth about life. It is not safe, you will get hurt a lot, and you'll ride all the way home burnt beyond belief. In 2018, Johnny Knoxville, the Jackass star, released a feature film called Action Point, inspired by the park. In 2020, HBO released Class Action Park, a documentary that became one of the streaming service's most watched non-fiction offerings that year. A book by Andy Mulvihill and Jake Rawson followed. A Hulu television series was announced. The park where people got hurt had become, in death, an industry. A popular list that has circulated by email for years, titled "You Know You're from New Jersey When," begins with a single entry: "You've been seriously injured at Action Park." The concrete chute is gone. The route remains. If you take the gondola up the mountain at Mountain Creek and look down through the trees, you can trace the path of the old alpine slide, the curves where the carts jumped the track, the places where the hay bales used to be, the exposed rock where a 19-year-old boy hit his head one summer night in 1980 and did not get up. The mountain doesn't care what was built on it. It holds the shape of things.